So here's what Paul does. He's brilliant. He gives two examples to give an answer to the question, are there different stories, or has there always just been one way to be right with God? And so here he gives his first example in Romans chapter 4, verse 1. What then shall we say was gained by Abraham? Right? I mean, he's going to go Father Abraham. He's going to go back to a giant of the Old Testament. Everybody that had been Jewish, everybody that had followed the Jewish religion, if you had asked them, who is a hallmark of our religion, they would name a few people, and certainly one among them would have been Abraham. And so he goes, all right, what then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified, now that's just a big Bible word that means, well, you can say it this way, just if I'd never sinned. For if Abraham was made as if he had never sinned by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. So Paul says, hey, if Abraham had been able to do all of these great works in order to earn God's favor, in order to earn a right standing before God, he would have something to boast about before God. But Paul's like, he actually has nothing to boast about. In fact, he's like, hey, you want to talk about Abraham for a minute? Let's talk about Abraham for a minute. Let's talk about Abraham in the context of, is God moved by our good works for our salvation? And let's go back and let's look at the giant of the hero of faith in Abraham. Now, if you go back to Genesis 12, Abraham, his name is Abram at that time, he marries a girl named Sarai, and they are living out in the land of Haran, and they are just fun-loving pagans. Man, they don't know God. They don't know God's ways. They've never heard of God. They are not Jewish. They are not following God. They have no concept of any of that. They're just bumping along in life, just doing the making money, the having kids, whatever, they're just sort of rolling along in life. And he says, okay, here's Abraham. And by this time, he's now about 75 in Genesis 12. And so they're rolling along in their pagan lifestyle. And then Genesis 12:2, God shows up and God goes, hey, Abraham, I'm going to need you to go. Leave your land, go to another country. In this other country, I'm going to give the entire land to you. And I'm going to bless you. And I'm going to bless you so much that you are going to be a blessing to the entire world. Now think about that. What did Abraham do in order to earn that kind of blessing? Nothing. He did nothing. So the story fast forwards a little bit, and Abram and Sarai are living, and they go into Egypt, and a famine happens. And so as they go into Egypt, Abram looks at Sarai, and he's like, hey, babe, you're pretty hot. And the trouble is, when the king and the princes see you, and they know we're married, they're going to kill me. So, hey, babe, how about you just tell them we're brother and sister? Now, ladies, come on. I know that's sort of an uncomfortable chuckle, right? You'd be pissed. You'd be really mad if your husband was like, hey, to save my neck, why don't you just pretend like you're my sister and let everybody else have your way with it? That wouldn't fly. And then on the heels of that, in Genesis 15, God calls Abram out and he goes, hey, Abram, look up at the sky. Try to count all the stars in the sky. You can't do it, can you? I'm going to make your descendants more than all the stars in the sky. Now, what did Abram do in order to earn that kind of blessing from God? Nothing. There were no good works in order to earn that kind of promise. And then some years go by, 10 years go by in Abram's life, and they get impatient because they don't have kids yet. They're probably in their 90s at this point. So Abram's like, hey, I'll just take matters into my own hands. And so he has a child by his servant instead of by his wife. And then on the heels of that, in Genesis 17, God reiterates the promise to him and says, hey, listen, I know you're 99 years old and I know you're 100 years old. I'm going to give you that child that I promised to you. What did they do to earn that promise reiterated again? Nothing. In fact, they laugh at God. And then when they laugh at God, God says, no, I wasn't kidding. I really meant that. It really is going to happen. And then Abram bails on her. He becomes Abraham at this point, and Sarah. And then he bails on Sarah again a second time. And God comes back and he actually accomplishes what he promised. And so Paul looks at him and he goes, hey, your hero that you want to claim is the kind of the hallmark picture for do good works and then God will save you? Let's talk about Abraham for a minute. He's the exact opposite of that story. That it is not salvation by works. It is by a whole other different system. And so the question is, what is the system? And so in verse 3, he says, for what does the scripture say? Now, I love that question. We just have to pause. This is not the meaning of the message. But that's a great question. That when you start to wonder what's going on in your life, what does Scripture say about that? When you start to have doubts and questions about, is this really what God is like? What does Scripture say about that? When you have choices to make about your family, when you have choices to make about your career, when you have choices to make with your money, what does Scripture say about that? Because we all appeal to some authority. And I'm just telling you, this is a trustworthy one. And so Paul says, for what does Scripture say? Abram believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now, when Paul says that, he's actually quoting out of Genesis 15, chapter 15, verse 4. He's saying, here's what the Old Testament says about Abraham. In the middle of the story about Abraham, it says that Abraham believed, that Abraham had faith. Faith's like think of a three-legged stool. Faith in believing is, there is some information that you have to know. And then there's this sense in which you have to know it's true. But it's not just enough to know the information. And it's not just enough to know that the information is true. You actually have to put your weight on it. You have to trust on it. That faith is knowing this thing, believing it's true, and then resting your life up on it. And so, Abraham believed God. That Abraham didn't have faith in his faith. It didn't say that Abraham believed that he had so much faith that God would reward him. It just says that Abraham believed God, that his faith was in God. His faith was in the God that would promise a miracle child when there was no way to have a child. And through that child, the entire world would be blessed. Does that story sound familiar? That story is pointing to the gospel story of Jesus Christ. He goes on in verse 4. And he says, now, to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due, right? So if you work, you expect a paycheck. Hey, young guys, work, paycheck, girlfriend. It's an awesome little formula. You should try it. Ladies, you should have clapped louder. That was your chance. I went to bat for you. But when you work, you expect to be paid, right? My daughter, Sophie's 12 years old. And maybe it was like 2 weeks ago, she comes to Kristen and she's like, hey, Mom, I want a new workout shirt. Kristen's like, okay, if you need a new workout shirt, we'll get a new workout shirt. And she's like, what's the workout shirt? And Sophie's like, well, you just so happen to ask. Here it is. It's a $40 workout shirt. And Kristen's like, no, you're 12. You don't get a $40 workout shirt. Mom's 22. She doesn't get a workout shirt that's $40. Wait for it. There we go. And Sophie's like, no, we're just not going to give you a $40 shirt. And Sophie's like, okay, hold on. She goes back into like where Kristen's office is, her stuff back there, comes out with the computer, opens it up to a spreadsheet, and she's like, I've been keeping track of where you haven't paid me for the work for the last 3 months. Snap is right. Kristen's like, all right, well, I guess we're going to the store. See, work creates a debt relationship. You work, and then you're owed a wage for that. And so I love this. Tim Keller wrote this. I wrote this quote down. Tim Keller, an amazing pastor out of New York, he said, if salvation is not a gift, then God is obligated to save us. Now, I don't know about you. I don't feel real good about trying to obligate God to do anything. I just don't know. I'm not sure I want to be in that position with God. Hey, God, you owe me, right? Just as your employer is obligated to pay you. And that, of course, runs against the whole tenor of the Bible, parentheses, including Genesis 15, verse 4, which is what he just quoted. He's saying the whole work and earn, work and obligate God runs completely counter to the entire storyline of all of Scripture, including if you want to go all the way back to the heroes of the Old Testament. That you and I do not obligate God. God is not indebted to us by anything that we do. And the question is, even if it worked that way, let's just assume for a moment that you could work and earn your way into God's good graces. The question you have to ask is, how good is good enough? Like, if I do one thing wrong, think of like scales. If I do one thing wrong, do I have to do one thing good? And is even enough? Or do I have to do like 51-49? Or maybe it's not like a quantity of good works. Maybe it's quality of good works. Maybe it's like, if I sort of do this kind of sin, then like, hey, if I punch my sister, then I have to feed the poor. You know, but okay, so if I sort of tell a white lie to get the business deal, what do I have to do to offset that? See, it breaks down, because here's why it breaks down. We're never told. What does Scripture say? Scripture never says anything about what balances the scales. We're never told it's 1 for 1, 2 for 1, quality of good works for quantity of good works, whatever it is. We're never told any of that. And if that's the system, if God sets up a whole system that you and I are made right with Him by doing works, and we offset our bad by our good in either quality or quantity, and then God doesn't tell us what that is, the system by which to earn it, let's just be honest, that's a cruel system. And even worse than that, do you really want to live with that kind of fear and that kind of anxiety? Do you want to get to the end of your life and wonder, was it enough? Did I do good enough things in depth? Did I do good enough things in quantity? Do you want to live with that kind of fear and that kind of anxiety and that kind of worry in your life? And so Paul says, In verse 5, or you could say but to the one who does not work, one who does no good works, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. And I love this. Like, who is the him but believes in him who justifies the ungodly? The one you believe in is Jesus Christ. That's the gospel. That you place your faith and your trust in the perfect Son of God who came on a rescue mission for you and for me. He is the one, the only one, who redeems the ungodly. He's the one who justifies, who makes right ungodly people before a holy, righteous, good, godly God.